The house on 13th Street smelled of cinnamon ham and pine, the same mixture that used to mean celebration. I stepped through the front door, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. The voices in the dining room were loud, overlapping, cheerful in the way people become when they believe every place at the table has been claimed. I stood in the doorway. The table stretched long and bright under the weight of crystal glasses. Tapered candles, and name cards written in Bryn's careful cursive. I scanned each one twice. My name was not there. At the head of the table sat my son, Coulter. Shoulders squared, face set in that expression that once belonged to his father. He cut into the glazed ham as though it were his right, as though this room bowed to him. When I drew a breath, he didn't look up. "Your plate's outside with the dogs," he said. Voice even, not loud enough to count as a joke. The room went still, forks lowered, though no one said a word. Across from him, Bryn smoothed the edge of the pale green silk scarf looped around her neck, one that used to hang in the back of my closet. She sipped her wine and let her eyes drift past me, as though I were a neighbor who had stepped in by mistake. Heat crept up my face, but I kept my tone steady. I walked forward, set the gift box in the center of the table, and leaned down close to Coulter. He finally lifted his eyes to me, and for a moment I caught the boy he had been, the one who once cried when I scraped my knee on the ice. But that boy was buried deep. "Check under your plate," I whispered. His smirk flickered, uncertain, but I didn't wait to see what would follow. I straightened, turned, and walked back down the hallway. The laughter that had filled the room moments earlier stayed muted, contained by the weight of my silence. On the porch, the December air struck sharp against my skin. My breath fogged as I crossed the walk, the glow from Hyde Park's restaurants warming the street 2 blocks away. I gripped the car keys in my pocket and stepped into the night, knowing the gift on that table carried more than paper and twine. The morning after, I walked the Boise River greenbelt while the frost still clung to the grass. The geese cut lines across the pale water, their wings a steady rhythm against the quiet. I let the cold settle into my lungs the way medicine does, sharp but necessary. My mind drifted backward to the Christmases that once held us together. The tree was always crooked, no matter how we braced it with bricks, and the ornaments never matched. Graham would hold the cracked glass reindeer between us, smile that half smile, and say, "Peace doesn't pick sides." He'd hang it himself to end the argument between Coulter and me. That was his gift to steady the room when it tilted. I thought of the year I slipped on the ice near Camel's Back Park, splitting my lip open. I remember Coulter, small and panicked, crying harder than I did, shouting for help until Graham carried me inside. My son swore I wasn't allowed to die. Not ever. He pressed a blanket around me like a soldier guarding a post. That boy, that tenderness, had lived inside him once. The memory scraped raw against the images from last night, the curated table, Bryn's scarf draped like ownership, the silence that allowed cruelty to settle unchallenged. Somewhere between then and now, warmth cooled into ceremony. Love shifted into posture. I carried my hands deep in my coat pockets and thought of the holly leaf mug Graham gave me, the one chipped at the rim, but still mine. Last year, my stocking vanished from the mantel as if it had never hung there. I'd told myself it was an oversight, but even then, I knew better. The geese lifted again, turning south, and I kept walking, knowing the edits to my place in that house had not begun with the missing chair. Over the next few months, I stopped recognizing the house I had helped keep upright. On one visit, I paused in the hallway where our family photos once lined the wall. The frame of Graham and me at Payette Lake was gone, as if it had never hung there. In its place, a glossy print of Coulter and Bryn at a State Street garden center, showed them balancing a flat of mums, smiling like they had rescued the season. Later, scrolling through social media, I saw them again, this time around the dining table I used to set labeled impromptu family dinner. The caption made it sound casual, last minute, but every plate and glass matched. Candles lit. My name hadn't crossed anyone's mind, except maybe as an afterthought once the pictures were already posted. When I called to check on Graham, it wasn't Coulter or my mother who answered. It was Bryn, her voice cheerful in my kitchen, her spoon clinking against the cardinal print mug I'd given Graham years before. She laughed at something in the background, Coulter, probably before saying, "Your mom's elbow deep in pie dough." Your mom, as if I had no stake, no history, no claim beyond a casual title she could toss across the line. Each time I came by, I noticed more decisions had been made without me, medication schedules adjusted, finances shifted, explanations offered only after the fact. "It's easier through Coulter," my mother said once, her tone as if she were soothing me, though the words pressed like dismissal. So I began my own quiet work. When no one was watching, I took out my phone and snapped pictures of the walls, the closets, the drawers, inventory by memory, a record no one could erase. And one afternoon, while the others busied themselves in the kitchen, I slipped the holly leaf mug into my coat pocket and carried it back to my apartment. The chip at the rim dug against my finger as I set it in my cupboard, proof that something of mine still remained untouched, even as the rest of the house shifted beneath me. After Graham's memorial, the house on Harrison Boulevard filled with neighbors and cousins bearing covered dishes. The air outside was sharp with late winter, but inside, the rooms glowed warm. Bryn stood at the door in a black dress I recognized immediately. It wasn't hers, it had been mine, bought years ago for my uncle's funeral. Hem falling just above the knee, she greeted each guest with a measured smile, her hand light on their elbows, as if she'd always belonged in that doorway. I stood near the coat rack and listened. Bryn poured cider into glass tumblers and told stories about Graham as though she had sat beside him at every oil change, every snow-shoveled morning. He always said the key to a good day was starting early. She laughed, and the group nodded, grateful for an easy anecdote to cling to. No one questioned her version. It was smoother than the jagged truth of who had really been there. Across the room, Coulter moved like a conductor, introducing people, answering questions, steering conversations. He spoke of arranging medical appointments, handling bank matters, guiding our mother through decisions. He wasn't bragging, he believed it. In his mind, he had carried the weight when others faltered. Control, to him, was care, and care gave him the right to narrate. I pressed my hands together, steady. There was a time I would have challenged it, insisted on my own memories, demanded a correction. Instead, I let the moment pass. That evening, when the last dish had been cleared and I was alone in my apartment, I opened a notebook and began listing what I had noticed: the missing quilt from the guest bed, the absence of Graham's old tool belt from the hook, the way Bryn wore my dress without hesitation. I wrote it all down, line by line, because I knew the edits were no longer accidental. They were being curated. One weekday afternoon, I stopped by the house when I knew Coulter would be at work and Bryn occupied elsewhere. The rooms felt staged, as if scrubbed of personality. But the study at the back remained as it had always been. The air was still, carrying the faint tang of motor oil and dust. Graham's recliner sagged in the middle, a hollow molded by years of his weight. The old, self-winding clock on the shelf still ticked 10 minutes slow, its brass hands moving stubbornly in their own time. Against the far wall stood the dark wood cabinet with its brass handle. I had seen him open it a dozen times, always with a practiced flick, but never thought to ask what rested inside. Now, something tugged at my memory a night in high school. Graham slipping a tiny key into the spine of his worn copy of Travels with Charlie, just in case. He'd said, tucking the book back onto the shelf. I pulled the book down. The leather cracked with age and shook it gently. The key slid free into my palm. My hands trembled as I fitted it into the lock. At first the door resisted, then gave with a low groan. Inside, nested in a metal safe, lay an envelope thick with folded pages. I opened it on the desk. The document bore every mark of legitimacy, Graham's signature. 2 witnesses, a notarized affidavit, a self-proving will, clear and final. Every asset, the house, the savings, the land parcel outside Boise was left to me. Coulter's name was absent, as was Bryn's. Behind it lay a single-page note, blocky letters pressed heavy into the paper. Ione, I see it now. You stayed when others spoke over you. I'm sorry for letting that happen. This house is yours. You've earned it. Love, Dad. I pressed the paper flat, then scanned each page with my phone, storing copies in a folder labeled Only Records. The originals I returned to their envelope, sliding them back into place. The safe I closed, but the key I slipped into my pocket, cold metal against my hand as I stepped quietly out of the study. Back at my apartment off Vista Avenue, the snow flurries drifted sideways past the window, soft against the dull light of evening. I set the holly leaf mug on the counter and opened my laptop. I typed slowly, deliberately, into the search bar Idaho Probate Basics. The language was dry, stripped of drama, and that steadiness grounded me. I learned that in Ada County, an informal probate could be filed without hearings, without spectacle. If the will was self-proving and Graham's was signed by him, 2 witnesses, notarized, then the court would accept it without dispute unless someone forced the matter. It didn't require a fight. It required patience. I made a list. Notices to heirs, appointment of a personal representative, inventory of assets. Each step looked less like war and more like bookkeeping, a trade I knew well. Still, I needed assurance. A neighbor had once mentioned an attorney she trusted for estate work, Naya Culver. I called her office, my voice steady as I explained what I had found. By the next morning, she called back herself. Her tone was calm, practical. Yes, she said. The will was valid. Yes. The affidavit meant no one could claim Graham hadn't been of sound mind. You'll want to file after the holidays, she advised. Less noise. It's a simple process if you keep it simple. Let the law carry the weight. I thanked her. And we scheduled an appointment for early January. That night I opened a plain folder and began slipping pages inside. Copies of the will, scanned images of missing photos, dates when calls went unanswered, bank statements I had quietly tracked. I wrote in clean columns, like I used to when reconciling accounts. No flourish, just evidence. I wasn't building a case for revenge. I was building a record for order. And for the first time in months, I felt steadier than the storm outside, as if the ground under me had stopped shifting. By the time I closed the folder, the snow had thickened, whitening the street below, and I knew the holidays would end with a reckoning that didn't need my voice raised. On Christmas Eve, the Hartwell house glowed with colored lights strung unevenly across the porch. Laughter carried through the windows as I walked up the steps. The brown paper box tucked beneath my arm, I opened the door without knocking. The dining room spread before me in its familiar formality. Candles flickered. Glasses caught the light. Names written neatly on cards. Every seat was filled, none with mine. My absence had become tradition. Coulter sat at the head, his hand resting casually near Bryn's. He looked up only briefly, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, then turned back to the ham as though carving was more important than my arrival. Bryn smoothed the edge of her napkin, careful not to look at me directly. I walked to the center of the table and set the box down among the platters. The sound of cardboard against wood drew every eye. I leaned close to Coulter, my voice low. "Steady, check under your plate." His brow creased, the smirk uncertain for the first time in months. I didn't wait for questions. I didn't need them. I straightened, turned, and walked back down the hallway, my boots pressing against the polished wood with measured weight. Behind me, chairs scraped faintly as curiosity cracked the silence. The box lid would lift. Inside, they would find a notarized copy of Graham's will, his signature clear, the affidavit stamped, a copy of his letter folded gently. "Ione, I see it now. You stayed. You earned this house." And tucked beside it, a photograph from years ago. Graham and me shoulder to shoulder at the Bogus Basin trailhead, snow piled high, both of us smiling into the cold. Under Coulter's charger plate, taped beneath, lay the safe key, old brass, worn smooth, proof he had never truly held the authority he believed was his. By the time their voices rose, I had already stepped outside. The night air cut sharp, filling my lungs with something close to relief. Down the street, the bells of St. John's carried into the sky, each note steady, unbroken. As I walked into the winter dark, the days after Christmas came with a flurry of messages. My phone lit with texts, voicemails piling up, each one circling the same empty phrases. Bryn's voice arrived first. "Light as tissue. We're all caught off guard. Let's not make this bigger than it is." As if the ink on a notarized page were a misunderstanding. Coulter followed with a longer message. "We all misunderstood each other. We can fix this. Dad wouldn't want bitterness to ruin the family. He never said the word will. He never mentioned the letter. His language avoided the substance, wrapping itself in nostalgia and half-truths. Other relatives chimed in, cousins, a distant aunt, each invoking Graham's memory, each urging me to forgive, but none acknowledging the papers in their hands. They wanted sentiment to smooth over what law had already declared. I didn't block them. I didn't argue. I let the words arrive and fall into silence. One evening, I opened my journal and wrote a single line. "I don't need an apology that has me do the labor." Then I closed the book and set it on the nightstand. A ledger balanced. Coulter tried something different. He came to my workplace unannounced, walking into the nursery office off Chinden Boulevard. I never saw him. My receptionist met me later in the break room, still unsettled. "He didn't look like someone you want to see," she said. Shaking her head, I believed her. What rattled him wasn't only the loss of property, it was the shift in his role, the fracture in his claim to be the family's captain. For years, he'd spoken as though his word carried the seal of authority. Now, that authority lay in my folder, in the quiet certainty of Graham's signature. The silence I kept unsettled them more than any raised voice could. And it was that silence I carried with me into the new year. In early January, the streets of downtown Boise were crusted with old snow, the curbs lined with salt stains. I walked up the granite steps of the Ada County Courthouse with the folder tucked under my arm, my breath steady in the cold. Inside, the halls echoed with the muted shuffle of boots and the hum of fluorescent lights. Naya Culver met me outside the clerk's office, her handshake firm, her voice practical. We sat together at a narrow table. My folder opened between us. She flipped through the notarized will, nodding at each page. "Self-proving, properly executed," she said. "Ada County will accept it without issue." We filled out the forms line by line. The petition named me as personal representative, just as Graham had written. Statutory notices would go out to Coulter and Bryn as occupants, and to the few relatives who counted as heirs or potential creditors. Naya reminded me it was routine, nothing dramatic. "Don't let them drag you into theater," she said. "This process favors order. Use that." I asked about the locks, whether I should change them now. She shook her head. "Unless there's waste or risk of damage. Leave them. Start with an inventory. Request cooperation. Firm, but respectful. You hold the authority. Let them decide how they respond to it." When the filing was stamped and entered, I stepped back out into the thin winter sun, the courthouse steps icy under my shoes. For the first time, the weight felt less like a burden and more like balance restored. That evening, I slid a plain envelope into the post. No return address. No letter inside. Only a single photograph Graham and me in the shed, bent over the tool bench we had restored together. Sleeves rolled, hands stained with oil. I let the silence of the image speak what words could not, and I waited for the law to do the rest. By February, the Boise River had begun to break its shell of ice, the edges splintering into thin shards that carried downstream like glass. I walked the greenbelt under a pale sun, the air damp with thaw. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A neighbor had sent me a picture, unprompted, the photo of Graham and me at the tool bench. Newly hung, not in the living room, not above the mantel where guests could see, but in the shed behind the garden, the place that had always smelled of cedar shavings and oil. Crooked on the wall, thumbtacked above the workbench. It looked truer there than it ever would inside. Later that day, Coulter's name lit my screen. His message was short, stripped of pretense I'll cooperate. No apology, no confession, just an acknowledgement that the matter was no longer his to command. Bryn stayed silent, her absence louder than any words. I poured coffee into the holly leaf mug, the chip along the rim catching against my lip. It had grown since last winter. A sliver gone each season. I didn't try to hide it or mend it. Some things show their age honestly. I pulled my folder across the kitchen table, the same one where I had once laid out Christmas cards and grocery lists. Inside, the papers sat neat notices mailed, probate filed, responsibilities assigned. I penciled in dates for the house inventory, contacted a contractor for repair bids, drafted a timeline for the transition that would give space rather than take it, legally firm, but not punitive. I felt no glee, no rush of triumph. The victory wasn't mine to savor because it had never been a contest. What Graham had left me was steadier than property. It was the assurance that quiet truth outlasts noise, dignity, not drama, stewardship, not conquest. I closed the folder, set my mug beside it, and looked out across the parking lot where the snow had melted into long, wet streaks. The ground was softening, the river moving freely again, and with it, so was I. When your dignity becomes the deed, what does home allow and what does it finally refuse?